In the last segment, I was mentioning how Sadat decided to not to use his leverage. In fact, more than that, give up his leverage with us and with the Soviet Union, and just join our side of alliance in the Cold War alliance pattern, even though both parties, the United States and Soviet Union, were more than happy to increase his power to pay for his switching sides, or prevent him, in the case of Soviet Union, from switching side. Now, you got to ask yourself, what is going to happen? How much sense that makes? What is going to happen to Sadat's military power now that he's switching sides from the Soviet Union to us? Well, giving up his relation with the Soviet Union simply means that his military power will have to decline. Why? Because most of his weapons, his aircrafts, his transports, all of that were coming from the Soviet Union. To use them, he's going to need to get spare parts, and if he's not going to be their ally, he is now giving them the opportunity to hold off on the spare part. And of course, by choosing our side, the fact of the matter is that we would never, ever supply him with the kind of sophisticated weapon system that would make him a threat to Israel, let alone make him stronger than Israel. In fact, Israel would never allow us to do that, or for this to occur. In other words, he did not seem to realize that no American administration could arm an Arab state to the point that it would become militarily more powerful than Israel. Therefore, by switching to our side and now becoming dependent on us for his weapon system and for his supplies, he would always put Egypt and the Arab, to the extent that they're part of him, in the sense of being his allies, his ally, militarily second to Israel. And notice what that means. This means that Israel's fear of him would go down commensurately. In other words, Israel would not be as afraid and therefore not as willing to negotiate with him. So, within 5 years after the 1973 quote-unquote victory, Sadat would go down in the Arab world from being the great hero to being viewed almost universally as a traitor and the lackey of United States. So now, if you go on the graph, you'll see that 1978, what happens to coercion? It goes right back up because he has a lot of people who are opposed to him. In 1978, he signed a separate peace accord. Actually, the former signing took place in 1979, but 1978, the entire bargaining at Camp David occurred, and he destroyed the Arab bargaining base by taking out the most powerful and the most populous Arab state out of the equation by having a separate peace with Israel. Also, just a reminder, I mentioned that right after '67 war, under the Riyadh Plan, Nasser would do the same thing. So amazingly, he did it what Nasser would have done, but Nasser would have done it out of pure desperation, because he had lost and the Soviets were about to supply him. So he wanted to recover Egyptian territory in 1968. Sadat did it at the peak of its power. So by removing Egypt from the Arab side, the bargaining position of the Arabs were destroyed. Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and the Palestinians had lost the most important bargaining chip in their dealing with Israel. By themselves, these countries were too small, too weak, and lacked really sufficient leverage, sufficient bargaining strength to be taken seriously by Israel. So for the Israelis, the 1978 Camp David Accord enabled them to accomplish a divide and rule strategy. They had a separate peace with Egypt, took out Egypt, divided the Arab world, and now they could maintain that part of the territory that matters most to them, for Israel to be a greater Israel. So how foolish a man was he? Well, if you look at it from the criteria that I just, or from the facts that I just discussed, or by any rational criteria, he was a lousy bargainer and he just destroyed his bargaining base. A little later, though, I'm going to offer one explanation of Sadat's bewildering behavior. Anyway, going back to our control system, as he threw away his bargaining leverage, you can imagine Sadat's popularity went way down. By October of 1981, when he was assassinated, quite ironically, on the 8th anniversary celebration of the October War, coercion had gone way up. He was a dictator. Normative active had gone way down to the tertiary level, because he essentially was seen now as accommodating to Israel and destroying the Arab position. Normative habitual was also at the tertiary level, reflecting Sadat's diminished legitimacy and the legitimacy of his rule. And so, not surprisingly, when Sadat was assassinated, Egyptians took it very well. Early on in one of the very first lectures, I mentioned this thing about our view of Sadat in the West, and I mentioned Walter Cronkite, who was the CBS anchor who had gone to Cairo to cover funeral of Sadat, how shocked and surprised he was that nobody was mourning Sadat's death. By contrast, in 1970, I also mentioned, when Nasser died, the country really exploded in grief. This is really an excellent evidence. The reaction to the death of these two leaders is an excellent evidence of the extent of popularity that Sadat had lost in pursuing a separate peace with Israel and becoming dependent on the United States, which meant he was permanently going to be in the position of second to Israel. So the truth of the matter is that Sadat was much more popular in the West, especially in the United States, than he was with Egyptians and particularly Arabs. And this truism is really a good illustration of how deeply in the West, when we came to admire this man, really misunderstood Egypt, misunderstood Arabs, and misunderstood Sadat. We really never understood them. Now let me go back to what I mentioned about one explanation of Sadat's puzzling behavior with respect to how he ended up destroying his bargaining base, which he himself had built using Nasser's plan. The account that I'm going to provide is based on a dissertation of a student back in the 1980s who actually did some research, and I will going to distill the key points of it. But first, a little bit about Sadat's personality that is relevant to the overall context that I'm going to mention. Despite the fact that Sadat was the first Arab leader to officially visit Israel, in fact he went to Jerusalem in November of 1977, Sadat really didn't like Israel. Sadat truly was a bigoted man. His speeches are very revealing by contrast to the speeches by King Hussein of Jordan. And they're so revealing that his bigotry, even toward Israel, comes right out. Sadat was really an anti-Semite. He also called Hafiz al-Assad, the former president of Syria, the father of the current president who is now engaged in a civil war in his country. He called Hafiz al-Assad a dirty Alawi. And remember, something like 10, 11, 12% of the Syrian population is Alawi. Now, as to the explanation of his puzzling behavior. Sadat's assumption was, according to this research that I mentioned, was that if you take a very long-run view of history, he will be vindicated as a great Arab leader, and that Israel will be defeated by his strategy. How so? The explanation brings in what I told you earlier about his relation with the Shah of Iran. So Iran really comes into picture now. Sadat was fascinated by the Shah of Iran. Recall how the Shah saw himself in one of his interviews, actually with an American journalist, I believe it was with 60 Minutes, the Shah mentioned that soon Iran will be pushing Germany aside and making Iran the fifth great power in the world. The Shah was a megalomaniac, no question about it. Sadat saw the Shah's success during the late 1960s and early 1970s due to one important factor: his willingness to play the role of surrogate for the United States. That's why he was so strongly supported by the West. Therefore, Sadat wanted to play the same role. He wanted to emulate the role of the Shah, to become a surrogate of the United States and the West in the western part of the Middle East and North Africa, because the eastern part was taken care of by the Shah. So in a manner of the Shah, Sadat was going to provide the force. Egypt had a large population, even larger than Iran, provided that the Americans give him a lot of military wherewithals, and would take care of West's problems in the western tier of the Middle East and North Africa. So, lest we have forgotten, with the Shah towering over the Persian Gulf, we never felt in the United States to develop a force for that region. We didn't have a force for the Middle East, really. And this lack of a force, this absence of a force, became patently clear right after the Iranian Revolution, when the Carter administration frantically tried to create a so-called rapid deployment force, because Shah was gone now. The idea of rapid deployment force soon morphed into what we call today Central Command, or CENTCOM, which is headquartered in Florida. That was created in the aftermath of Iranian Revolution, so that we do have a force dealing with challenges facing us in the Middle East. But so long as the Shah was around, we didn't need that. And remember, the first batches of F-14 aircrafts went to Iran, not the United States Navy. So this idea, this plan was in Sadat's head, and he believed that he and the Shah would jointly control all of the greater Middle East and North Africa. So Sadat would divide up with the Shah of Iran the responsibility for protecting West's interests and for solving West's problems in the entire region. The combination of the two will take care of all the insurgencies and all the revolutions that are going to perk up in the region. And thereby, the two of them will ensure the survival of all the moderate, responsible allies of the West. And it was in this context that Sadat believed that his plan will make Israel strategically insignificant, because the main show going to be Iran and Egypt, the two large, big, populous countries, and Israel will be unimportant and not needed for anything else. And in time, he even believed that Israel may recognize its own insignificance, that it would go back to the 1948 borders. And thus, Sadat would be able to eventually wrench out of Israel a homeland for Palestinians. Now note, this explanation fit his behavior. It's a logical fit. But the problem was, of course, the Arabs saw him as a puppet. The other thing was that there was no reality to this plan. Sadat was unbelievably disappointed when we didn't keep the Shah of Iran and help him to save his throne when the Iranian Revolution occurred. Because from his thinking, how could we let that happen? Our most important surrogate is going to get thrown out. After the Shah was overthrown by the revolution, Sadat was the only world leader willing to give Shah a permanent rather than temporary refuge. And the ailing Shah, he was suffering from cancer, once he became a Flying Dutchman, he took him on and told him to come to Egypt, treated him with dignity, and the Shah is actually buried in Egypt. But he was really puzzled. I think by the time of Iranian Revolution, he was wondering whether or not, what's going on with the United States not supporting the Shah? Because if they don't support the Shah, how on earth are they going to support Sadat? The fact of the matter was that Sadat truly misunderstood us. We were interested in containing the Soviet Union, not containing the world. It was never in the cards that we would spend the kind of resources to do what Sadat wanted us to do. That is, to dominate the whole area. We don't mind the domination, but it's got to come at a much lower cost. And also, let me end to point out one of the problems with Sadat was that he truly had a contemptuous view of the masses. Public opinion didn't matter. He didn't understand his own people. He didn't understand the region. And here was the man who was expecting us to rely on him to control change in one of the most tumultuous areas of the world, and an area that was finally trying to assert itself and get rid of outside powers' influence in the region.